He did not speak when the planet died. He only listened to the sound of everything vanishing. This is the story of Darth Nihilus, the Lord of Hunger. The Sith who did not want power, only silence. The last moments of Malachor V did not come with screams. They came with stillness. Ships burning in the sky, bodies frozen mid-breath, and deep beneath the surface, a superweapon ignited by the hand of a Jedi who no longer believed in salvation. The mass shadow generator crushed everything. Gravity tore metal from bone. The planet cracked open, and the Force screamed louder than any voice ever could. He was there. He stood where the death began. And when it ended, he was still standing. But something inside him was not. He had been a soldier once. A warrior fighting under Revan's command during the Mandalorian Wars. He believed the war would bring meaning. It only brought fire. The explosion did not kill him. It emptied him. Not his body, but the space within. Where once there had been loyalty, fury, grief, now there was nothing. He walked among the corpses, unaware that he was still breathing. The sky had turned to ash. The air smelled of burned blood. And in the silence, he heard something that no one else did. It was not a sound. It was the absence of all sound. A wound in the Force, deep and unnatural, centered not on the battlefield, but on him. He could not look away from the ground beneath his feet. It pulsed faintly, as if still alive, as if the planet had not died, but been devoured. And something in him resonated with it. Others fled the system. The Jedi turned their backs on what they had done. The Republic hushed the story into silence. But he remained. He did not remember why. He did not speak. He did not sleep. For days, or maybe years, time blurred in the quiet. And the Force which had once flowed through him like light, now coiled around him like smoke. Sometimes he would see faces. The dead, his comrades, his enemies, even Revan far away and unreachable. All of them flickered in and out of his vision like ghosts. He would try to speak to them, but no words came. Only breath, only hunger. At first, he thought it was madness. But it was not. It was the Force trying to find itself through the void he had become. Something had changed when Malachor died. Not just in the galaxy, but in the very nature of the Force itself. He had become a wound, a tear in reality. And wherever he walked, the Force bent to avoid him. It did not flow through him. It recoiled from him. The survivor did not understand what he was becoming, but he could feel it. In his bones, in the air, in the way animals fled before they saw him. In the way stars seemed to dim when he looked up. He was still alive, but only in shape. Inside, something had begun to die, and what replaced it was hungry. He wandered, not to escape. There was nowhere left to go. The war had ended, but peace had not returned. Not to the galaxy, and not to him. His body moved across ruined systems, across graveyards of forgotten battles. He did not remember boarding ships or speaking to anyone. He drifted like wreckage, caught in the slow current of galactic guilt. Jedi temples stood silent. Republic outposts no longer looked for survivors. The galaxy wanted to forget, but he remembered everything. He remembered the faces of Mandalorians twisted in agony as the gravity tore their armor apart. He remembered Jedi who broke their oaths to follow Revan, only to vanish into nothing. He remembered the way the Force had recoiled at Malachor, as if it too had been wounded by their hands. He was not a man anymore. He was memory, rotting in real time. He tried to feel something, guilt, grief, even fear. But the feelings would not come. Only the dull echo of what once was. He would sit in the hulls of broken cruisers staring at stars through fractured glass. Sometimes he would speak aloud, but his voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Empty, detached, worn thin from disuse. He met others in his travels, refugees, smugglers, even Jedi in hiding. Some saw him as just another drifter, but some could feel it. The darkness around him, the wrongness. They would flinch when he drew near. Some tried to run, others tried to help. None of them stayed long, and some never left at all. He did not kill them, not with intent, but when they reached for him through the Force, they found nothing. And in that emptiness, they lost themselves. He began to understand, slowly, painfully, that whatever had happened to him, it was not fading. It was growing. The wound was not healing. It was widening. And he was no longer just touched by it. He was part of it. The Force whispered in dreams he did not remember having, ancient voices, echoes of things lost long before Malachor. He did not understand their words, only their hunger. There were days when he forgot his own name, forgot his own face. He would catch his reflection in the darkened hull of a ship and not recognize the man staring back. Was he Sith? Was he Jedi? Was he even alive? The answers no longer mattered. What mattered was the silence. It followed him, surrounded him, grew stronger the more he tried to reach out. The Force had always been life, breath, connection. But now it was absence. Cold, dry, consuming. He came to fear it. Not because it hurt, but because he no longer needed it. He could feel life without touching the Force. He could feel people, not their presence, but their energy, their light, their flame, and he was drawn to it. At first, he would simply sit near them, listen to their laughter, their quiet breath. But then something inside him would shift, and when he left, they would not wake. He began to leave trails, empty houses, ships adrift, settlements where the dead had no wounds, only vacant eyes. He hated himself, but not in the way he once had. It was not emotion. It was instinct, a knowing that he was losing whatever made him a man, and what replaced it was older than pain. The galaxy did not mourn him. It had already buried too many. The Republic called the Mandalorian Wars a victory. The Jedi called it a lesson, but to him it was betrayal. They had promised purpose. They had spoken of justice, of light, of duty, but when the killing was done, they looked away. They returned to their temples and meditated on peace, while the dead of Malachor still whispered in the dark. The generals they once praised became outcasts. The heroes they built became ghosts. And in that silence, something twisted inside him. He remembered Revan, the leader who had turned from the council to fight, and in doing so had changed everything. Revan had believed that power could save the galaxy, but he had seen what that power did. It did not heal. It consumed. The others who fought beside him were scattered. Some vanished into the unknown regions. Some fell to the same darkness they once swore to destroy. And some, like him, were simply forgotten. The Jedi Order spoke of balance. But what balance could exist after a world like Malachor? After a wound so deep the Force itself bled. He searched for answers, though he no longer knew why. He found only echoes, reports of the Jedi exile, Mitra Surik, being cast out for surviving what others could not. They called her empty. They called her dangerous. He wondered if she felt what he felt, the cold that never ended. The hum in his bones that was not sound but hunger. Perhaps she did. Perhaps all of them who stood at Malachor were marked, not by choice but by the Force itself. He tried to find her once. He followed rumors, fragments of coordinates, messages carried in whispers between smugglers and soldiers. But she was gone, lost among the outer worlds. And so he wandered again. Each world he reached felt thinner, as if his very presence drained it. The Force bent away from him. Animals fled. Children fell silent when he passed. Even the air seemed afraid to move. He began to understand what the Jedi would never admit, that some wounds could not be healed, that the Force, for all its power, could break. And when it broke, something else took its place. He remembered the faces of the Jedi Council, serene and distant. He remembered their words that victory must never come through fear, that compassion was the only path. But compassion had not saved Malachor. Compassion had not saved anyone. He clenched his fists until the skin split. No pain came, only the quiet pulse of the void within. He began to see the Force differently, not as light or dark, but as hunger and silence. Where others drew strength, he felt depletion. Where others reached for connection, he found isolation. He no longer blamed the Jedi. He no longer blamed Revan. He blamed the Force itself. The war had revealed its cruelty, how it gave power, then demanded blood to sustain it. And now it had given him nothing but emptiness. So he accepted it. Not as a curse, but as truth. He stopped seeking warmth. He stopped looking for meaning. He stopped trying to remember who he was. And slowly, the galaxy began to forget too. He no longer spoke. Not because he had nothing to say, but because language could not hold what he felt. The emptiness was no longer just inside him. It surrounded him, followed him, fed on him. At first he thought it was grief, but grief fades. This did not. It was like a second presence living beneath his skin. Cold, silent, patient. He stopped sleeping. Or perhaps he no longer dreamed. The nights passed without change. His body moved, but his spirit hovered somewhere else, detached, unanchored. He wandered through forgotten systems, ruins, tombs, places where the Force once flowed strong, now reduced to dust and stillness. He was drawn to them. Not by curiosity, but by instinct, the way a predator returns to the scent of blood. And in those places, he began to feel stronger. Not brighter, not more alive, but heavier, darker, as if the silence inside him had found its reflection in the silence of the galaxy. He found he could feel life across great distances, not through connection, but through absence. He could sense people the way one senses heat from a fire. And slowly, he began to feed. It was not intentional. Not at first. A whisper here. A flicker of motion in the Force. And then, nothing. A village would fall quiet. A crew would vanish without a trace. He would leave and silence would remain. The hunger was no longer just a feeling. It was a need. It gnawed at him when he was near others. It pulled at him when he was alone. He came to understand what the Jedi could not. That the Force was not just light and destiny. It was survival. And survival, in its purest form, was hunger. He had no name. Not anymore. Whatever he had been, warrior, servant, man, had been lost when Malachor fell. All that remained was the wound, the echo. He began to wear a mask, not to hide, but to forget. The face beneath it no longer mattered. Only the silence he carried did. The mask became a symbol, not of identity, but of emptiness. A hollow shell for a hollow being. There were whispers of him now. Among Force sensitives, among survivors. A presence felt, not seen. A darkness that did not corrupt, only consumed. Some said he was a spirit. Others said he was death made flesh. None understood, because none had stood on Malachor when the scream began. The hunger could not be named because it had never lived. It had only been awakened. He no longer questioned it. He no longer feared it. He welcomed it. He began to travel toward worlds known to the Jedi, places where the Force pulsed brightest, temples, enclaves, hidden sanctuaries, not to destroy them, but to feed on their light, to drown the noise of the living Force in silence. He was not Sith. Not yet, but he was no longer what he had been. And as he drifted between stars, wearing a mask that hid nothing, the Force began to tremble. Because something had emerged from the ashes of Malachor. Something that could not be reasoned with. Something that could not be healed. A void in the shape of a man. And one day soon, it would speak. There was one who watched him from afar. Not through eyes, but through the fractures of the Force. She did not flinch when she felt his presence. She listened, because in his silence she heard an answer. Darth Kreia had once been Jedi. Kreia, master, historian, philosopher. She had taught many things: patience, insight, trust. But when she questioned the will of the Force, they cast her out. Like a broken mirror, no longer useful. She wandered the ruins of lost worlds, her mind consumed by one question. If the Force was truly balanced, why did it choose to suffer? That was when she found him. Not in person, not at first, but in ripples. Across the fabric of the Force, echoes that should not have existed. A presence that swallowed rather than touched. A wound that pulsed with hunger. She traced the disturbance back to Malachor, the place where Jedi had chosen genocide, the place where Revan had gambled with eternity. And there, amid the shadows, she found him. He did not speak. He did not move when she approached. He sat at the edge of the Traius core, where ancient stone hummed with forbidden knowledge. Dust fell around him, but he did not breathe it in. He was not meditating. He was unraveling. Others would have killed him, or fled. But Kreia knelt before him and placed her hand on the ground. The Force recoiled, but she did not, because she understood what he was. Not a Sith, not yet, but the echo of the Forcist's failure. A man so consumed by suffering, he had become its reflection. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "You are not empty. You are full of pain." He did not answer, but something turned toward her, not his eyes, not his body. Something deeper. The wound within him acknowledged her. Kreia did not offer healing. She offered purpose. She had studied the Sith, their rituals, their betrayals, their lies. She had walked among Jedi who feared the dark but never understood it. But this man, this being, he was neither. He was what happened when the Force broke something and refused to fix it. She did not ask his name. She knew it was already gone. She gave him a new one. Nihilus. It meant nothing. And that was the point. Because he was no longer a man. He was a void with shape, a hunger with memory. She did not teach him the way of the Sith. She taught him to stop pretending he was still human. To listen not with his ears but with the wound. To feel not the Force but its absence. Under her guidance, he began to move again. Not with strength, but with gravity. As if the galaxy itself leaned away when he passed. She brought him to what remained of the Traius Academy, ancient, broken, buried in the crust of Malachor. Together, they walked through its halls. Together, they awakened what had been left behind. Not just knowledge, but power. Old power. The kind that did not speak of balance, only of survival. Kreia did not see him as a student. She saw him as a mirror. A reminder that the Force could wound and never apologize. And Nihilus, he did not see her as a master. He saw her as a voice in the void. The only one he did not want to consume. Not yet. He was not alone. Another shadow moved through the halls of Malachor. Slower, heavier, louder. Pain followed him like a trail of smoke. He did not speak it. He wore it. Darth Sion. the Lord of Pain. A man who had died more times than most could count. But he refused to remain dead. His flesh had long since collapsed. His skin cracked with every step. Bones shifted beneath broken muscles, held together not by medicine or technology, but by will. He had once been a warrior, a Sith marauder under Exar Kun, a destroyer of Jedi, a killer without shame. But when his body failed him, the Sith cast him aside. They left him to rot. And in that rot, he learned to hate, not just the Jedi, but weakness itself. He found Malaka as Nihilus had, drawn not by curiosity, but by gravity. The gravity of pain. Kreia saw him too. She did not flinch at the sight of his wounds. She saw something familiar in the way he clung to suffering. Where Nihilus was void, Sion was agony. Where Nihilus could not feel, Sion could not stop feeling. They were opposites. And yet they were bound by the same fracture, the same rejection, the same truth the Jedi would never admit, that the Force could break its children and leave them behind. The first time Nihilus and Sion stood in the same room, the Force trembled. Not from fear, from recognition. The Sion stared at the masked figure who made no sound. He could feel nothing from him. No life, no anger, no warmth. It unsettled him. He lashed out once, not out of hate, but to test, to see if the hollow man could bleed. He could not. The blade passed through cloth, through air, through nothing. Nihilus did not fight back. He only turned. Sion fell to his knees, not in defeat, but in exhaustion. His pain had no effect on a being with no soul to wound. Kreia watched it unfold with quiet satisfaction. She did not want followers. She wanted instruments. And in these two she found the extremes of her vision. One who felt everything, and one who felt nothing. They did not trust each other. They never would, but they shared a purpose. Not conquest, not empire, something colder, deeper. A belief that the Jedi had failed the galaxy, that the Force itself had betrayed its creators. They began to train together, not in unison, but in parallel. Sion taught his body to endure through hatred. Nihilus taught his soul to vanish through hunger. And Kreia whispered between them, words sharper than blades, truths older than time. She spoke of the Jedi Sept's blindness, of the Sith's arrogance, of the lies baked into the galaxy Sept's history. They listened, not because they believed, but because belief had already died inside them. All that remained was need. And so the three of them, pain, silence, betrayal, became something the galaxy was not ready to name. A shadow with three faces, a wound with three voices, a storm that had not yet begun to fall. But when it did, there would be no survivors. The Trajas Academy did not echo with life. It whispered. Stone corridors breathed with secrets. Walls bled shadows. And deep below its foundation, the Force twisted like smoke trapped beneath glass. It was not a place of learning. It was a place of forgetting. Here the Jedi Code meant nothing. Here the rule of the Sith had not yet formed. Only one truth remained. The Force could be bent, and then it could be broken. Kreia walked its halls like a priestess in mourning. She did not rebuild the Academy in the image of the old Sith. She rebuilt it in defiance of everything that came before. The holocrons she unearthed were not instruction. They were warnings. Not of failure, but of pride. And she listened to them, not to obey, but to correct. She taught Nihilus and Sion not how to gain power, but how to abandon belief. She did not demand loyalty. She demanded clarity. To Sion, she gave discipline, not to heal, but to make his pain a weapon. To Nihilus, she gave silence, deeper than meditation, darker than death. a stillness so complete that even the Force dared not enter. They did not gather students, they gathered survivors, Jedi broken by war, outcasts lost in the Outer Rim, acolytes seeking power but not understanding cost. Each one who entered the academy came looking for strength, but strength was never what they found. They found darkness that asked for nothing and took everything. Some ran, some fell, most were unmade. Those who endured did not leave. They faded, until only fragments remained of memory, of voice, of will. The academy became a tomb that trained its own keepers, not Sith Lords, but ghosts. And in the center of it all, Kreia whispered to her two instruments, plans that spanned galaxies. Vengeance not through armies but through silence. She did not want to kill the Jedi. She wanted to unmake them, to sever their connection to the Force, to show the galaxy what the Force truly was when it stopped pretending to care. And Nihilus, he listened without blinking. He began to speak again, not in words, in waves, in hunger. His voice was not heard. It was felt like pressure behind the eyes, like a scream inside a sealed room. Language melted in his presence. And still Kreia did not fear him, because she believed he was the key, the final wound, the proof that the Force could be silenced. Sion did not trust her. He saw the cracks in her plan, the arrogance, the same arrogance he had seen in Exar Kun, the same arrogance that always led to betrayal. But he remained, because pain had no home but Malachor, and rage had no voice but hers. They called it teaching, but it was not. It was unraveling. Unraveling the lies of the Jedi, unraveling the hopes of the Sith, unraveling the Force itself. And as the academy sank deeper into the planet Set's crust, and its masters sank deeper into their truths, a quiet resolve formed. Not to rebuild the galaxy, but to erase the lie that had shaped it, the lie of destiny, the lie of balance, the lie that the Force was ever meant to be obeyed. There were no ceremonies, no oaths, no declarations of power. Only three beings sitting in the dark, each broken in a different way, and together they became something worse. They did not call themselves masters. They did not speak of Sith codes or golden empires. They called themselves the Triumvirate, Darth Kreia, Darth Sion, Darth Nihilus. Betrayal, pain, hunger. They did not agree. They did not trust. But the Force had wronged them all, and that was enough. From Malachor, they reached into the shadows of the galaxy, not to raise armies, to find the forgotten. The Jedi had thinned, their numbers broken by war, their purpose scattered. And so, one by one, the Triumvirate hunted them, not by blade, but by silence. Jedi Masters disappeared from distant worlds. Temples fell without battle. Enclaves went dark. Those who survived spoke of a presence that consumed the Force itself, a hollow wind, a voice without sound. It was not war. It was erasure. Where Nihilus passed, life withered. Where Sion walked, death lingered and refused to finish its work. Where Kreia spoke, belief cracked and collapsed. They did not strike from above. They bled into the cracks left behind by the Mandalorian Wars, cracks the Jedi never sealed. And in those cracks, they planted a question. What if the Force was not guiding them? What if it was only watching? As everything fell apart, the Triumvirate thrived in secrets. They moved like echoes, shadows that touched only when it was already too late. Some Jedi turned, some fell, most simply vanished. The Council sensed the danger, but their vision was already clouded. They searched for armies. They found none. They searched for Sith. they found silence. And silence was the answer. For Nihilus, silence was a weapon. For Sion, it was agony. For Kreia, it was proof. Proof that the Force could be questioned, denied, shattered. But beneath the unity, fractures deepened. Sion resented Kreia's words, her endless teachings, her belief that the galaxy could be reshaped through philosophy. He saw Nihilus, silent and growing colder, and feared he would become next. Kreia, in turn, watched them both. And in her mind she began to see not allies, but outcomes. She believed she could guide the wound, shape it, control it. But the Force does not beg to be controlled. And those who try, always fall. Still for a moment, the Triumvirate held. A blade with 3 edges, pointed at the heart of everything the Jedi believed. Not for control, not for dominance, for absence, for undoing, for the end of meaning itself. Because what they sought was not to rule the galaxy. They wanted it to forget. Forget the Force, forget the Jedi. Forget that it was ever meant to be saved. And somewhere deep within the crust of Malachor Viev, where nothing green had grown in years, a single breath echoed. A breath that was not life, but hunger preparing to speak. He did not remember who he had been, only what remained. And that too was fading. Kreia stood before him, not as a master, not as a guide, but as a witness to something ancient and wrong. The Force around him twisted like wind around a dying star. It moved, but not toward him. It recoiled. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence filled the room like cold filling an empty cup. No thoughts, no emotion, only stillness. She saw it in him, a reflection of her own disillusionment, shaped into something darker than even she had imagined. He had not turned to the dark side. He had simply fallen through the Force and kept falling. And in that bottomless descent, she found opportunity. A vessel, a wound, a blade that would not break. She gave him no lessons. He could not follow, could not hold memory, could barely hold shape. But he listened. He listened in ways the Jedi never had. Listened to the meaning behind her bitterness, to the war beneath her calm, to the hatred buried beneath her words, hatred not for enemies, but for the Force itself. And in him that hatred found silence, the kind that does not reply, the kind that erases. She gave him a name, Nihilus, a word with no root in any tongue, a sound that felt like forgetting. It was not meant to honor, it was meant to contain, because she knew what he was becoming, and she needed to give it form before it lost all shape. The mask came next, not crafted, found, recovered from the ruins of an old temple beneath the surface of Malachor. No one remembered who had worn it before, but the moment he touched it, the Force pulsed in retreat. He placed it over his face, not to hide, but to let go, to abandon the memory of his features, to sever the last thread of who he had been. From that day forward, no one saw his face again, and no one would hear his voice in words. He was present but not alive, moving but not breathing, listening but only to hunger. The others in the academy began to speak of him in whispers. Some said he had died long ago. Others said he was not dead, but death itself. Kreia watched closely. She did not speak his name often. She knew names held power. But more than that, she sensed that soon, even this name, Nihilus, would fade beneath what he was becoming. The Force no longer obeyed him. It feared him. It did not flow through him. It vanished around him. When he stood near others, they grew weak. Their breath shortened. Their thoughts became clouds. Some collapsed without injury. Some never rose again. And he felt nothing. No satisfaction. No triumph. only the faintest flicker of ease. As if the silence inside him had been slightly fed, Kreia did not stop him. She encouraged it. Not openly, but through careful permission. She knew that to direct him would be to break him, but to observe, to allow, that was how she would learn what the Force feared most. In Nihilus she saw not power, but proof. Proof that the Force could be devoured. That connection could be severed. That the very foundation of the Jedi could be undone. She believed he would be the instrument of that belief. But even she, in her wisdom, did not yet understand what he would become. Because Nihilus was not merely wounded, he was vanishing, cell by cell, thought by thought, until only the hunger remained. And that hunger had just been given a name. It began quietly, like a whisper carried through stone, barely felt, barely heard. The others in the Trajas Academy noticed it first. Meditations would break without reason. Acolytes would faint in the corridors, drained of strength though untouched. Lights flickered for no cause. The air thinned, and at the center of it all was Nihilus. He did not move with intent. He did not act with awareness. He simply existed, and the Force recoiled around him. Kreia called it awakening. Sion called it madness. But Nihilus called it nothing, because he did not speak anymore. He was still human in shape, but only in shape. Inside he was something else. Something deeper. Something older. The hunger had begun. At first, it came as a pulse, a faint sensation when others used the Force nearby. Their power called to him like warmth to cold. He did not understand it. He only responded. When an acolyte reached out in meditation, she collapsed. Her life drained in seconds. The Force she had touched was gone, devoured, not by will but by proximity. Kreia studied it with fascination and fear. This was no technique, no ritual. It was instinct. The Force did not flow through Nihilus. It flowed into him, and it never came back. At first, he resisted. He would retreat to the depths of Malachor, trying to be alone. But isolation made it worse. The hunger grew louder in silence, like a storm pressing against the walls of his mind. He began to crave the presence of others, not for company, but for sustenance. Every living thing around him was fuel. Every breath, a temptation. Every flicker of life in the Force, a voice begging to be silenced. When he fed, he did not kill out of anger. He simply absorbed. And each time he did, his body decayed further. Flesh thinned, bones hollowed. Even his shadow seemed to fade, as if light refused to cling to him. Kreia saw what was happening. She should have stopped him, but she did not. Because this was the moment she had waited for, the birth of the proof she had sought. She began to speak to him of purpose, of how the Jedi were parasites on the Force, of how true freedom could only come when the Force itself was undone. Her words found no understanding in him, but they did not need to. They found resonance. Nihilus listened not with thought, but with hunger. And in his hunger, her teachings rooted themselves like seeds in ash. Sion grew restless. He did not trust what Kreia was building. He watched Nihilus from the shadows, and for the first time he felt fear. Because Sion Set's pain gave him life. But Nihilus Set's hunger, unmade life. Pain could exist in defiance of death, but hunger did not recognize death at all. It devoured both the living and the dead. When Nihilus began to walk among the acolytes again, they fell in silence wherever he passed. Dozens died before Kreia commanded him to stop. He did not move, did not acknowledge, and yet he obeyed. Not out of loyalty, but because obedience required less thought than rebellion. His mind was unraveling, memories blurred, voices echoed without meaning. Only the call of the Force remained, a sound like wind through an open grave. Kreia realized then that his hunger could not be controlled, only directed. She began to speak to him not as a man, but as a weapon, a storm, a necessary silence. And for a time, it worked. He became still. He fed only when commanded. He followed when guided. But inside that stillness, something enormous stirred. Something that was not Kreia Sip's will. Something that was not the Force. The hunger had learned to listen, and soon it would learn to speak. There were no more lessons, only silence and the echo that followed it. Kreia thought she had shaped him. She had not. Nihilus had begun to move on his own. He no longer walked among the living as one of them. Wherever he passed, the air seemed thinner, sound bent, light dimmed. The Force recoiled like a wounded animal. He no longer reached for life. Life reached for him and vanished. The others in the academy called it feeding, but to Nihilus it was breathing, instinct, survival. He would enter a chamber of apprentices, stand in stillness, and draw in air that was not air. And within seconds, all would fall. Their bodies intact, their minds erased, their connection to the Force gone. Not severed, consumed. It was not hate that drove him. It was need, and that made him far more dangerous. Sion watched from a distance, his cracked hands trembling with anger. He despised Nihilus, this hollow thing that destroyed without fury. Sion's power came from his defiance, his will to suffer and still rise again. Nihilus had no such will, no emotion, no fire. He was the death that forgot to die. And even Kreia began to feel it. Each time she drew near, she could sense pieces of herself slipping away, thought by thought, breath by breath. She tried to resist, to shield herself with the Force, but resistance only made the hunger stronger. He fed on her too, though not enough to kill her. Perhaps he remembered that she had given him purpose, or perhaps he simply was not hungry enough. The academy began to crumble, not from attack, from absence. Rooms once filled with whispers now held only quiet. Holocrons dimmed, their memories drained. Even the planet's crust began to hum beneath his presence. Malachor, the wound that birthed him, answered his call. The dark side pulsed beneath its surface, feeding his emptiness. The world was dying again, slowly, constantly, and in that endless decay he grew stronger. When Kreia finally looked upon him, she no longer saw her creation. She saw a being unbound by any law of the Force, a void that could devour worlds and still remain unsatisfied. But she did not stop him, not yet, because she still believed she could use him, that his hunger could be the tool that would end the Force itself. She began to send him away from Malachor, small worlds, outposts, places where the Force still lingered strong. She told him they were Jedi enclaves, that they were fragments of the old order, waiting to be purged. He went without question, and when he arrived, silence followed. Ships that carried him did not return. Transmission signals faded mid-sentence. Entire colonies turned to dust in his shadow. When he fed, the sound was unlike anything alive. Not a scream, not a roar, but a void, a sound that erased itself. Witnesses described it as pressure, as the air being pulled from their lungs, and then nothing. The Jedi began to whisper of a phantom, a presence that consumed the Force itself. They had faced darkness before, Exar Kun, Naga Sado, Revan. But this was something else. They could fight the dark side. They could resist corruption. But how do you fight the absence of the Force? They called him the Death that Walks. A name carried across systems, always spoken in quiet tones, because to speak it too loudly was to invite it closer. And yet the closer Nihilus drew to death, the less of himself remained. His body was withering, his will dissolving. The mask was all that tethered him, a face for a being who no longer had one. Kreia knew what was coming, but she had chosen her path. To end the Force, she had armed a monster that did not understand the difference between master and prey. And soon that difference would vanish. The galaxy never truly saw him, only what was left behind. A planet where every living thing had vanished. A Jedi enclave that had fallen silent overnight. A starship adrift, its crew intact, eyes open, souls gone. Nihilus left no banners, no scars, no messages, only silence. It was different from war. War left bodies, craters, smoke and memory. Nihilus left nothing to remember, only the feeling that something precious had been taken, something no one could name. The Jedi did not know how to fight him, because he did not kill in battle. He did not corrupt with words. He simply arrived, and the Force stopped answering. Entire systems cut off from the current that had once guided them. He did not drain planets for power. He fed because the hunger demanded it. The more he fed, the stronger the hunger became. And the more it grew, the less of him remained. Kreia had created a weapon, but that weapon was forgetting its purpose. Forgetting her. Forgetting everything but the need. Sion saw it and smiled, because he knew what Kreia did not want to admit. Nihilus was no longer a Sith, no longer a man. He was hunger given shape, and hunger devours all, even those who feed it. The Jedi called for silence. They stopped speaking his name. They removed records. They buried what little they knew in sealed archives. Not to protect others, to protect themselves. Because even the memory of him had weight. A pulse, a shadow cast backward through time. Those who studied him too long grew sick, disconnected. Some began to hear his voice in dreams, a voice that was not speech, only need, only the echo of a life erased. The Republic did what it always did. It turned away, focused on the rebuilding, the politics, the illusion of stability. But deep in the corners of the outer rim, the silence kept spreading. Nihilus had become more than a threat. He had become legend. Not the kind that inspired, the kind that terrified. The kind told at the edge of a campfire, in whispers, a masked figure who could strip the Force from your soul before you knew he was near. They said he no longer walked. He drifted, as if gravity pulled him toward life, and life vanished when he arrived. He had a ship now, a vessel built of shadows and echoes, the Ravager, a warship from the Mandalorian Wars, ruined, shattered, but bound together by the dark side. He had no crew, only slaves, and even they did not last long. He would stand at the bridge, unmoving for days, weeks, until the hunger called, and then the ship would change course. Not to invade, not to communicate, but to feed, and then another world would go silent. Some in the galaxy chose to believe he had died, that no being could survive such power, that such a presence would burn itself out. They were wrong, because Nihilus was not fire. He was not death. He was the absence of both. He did not burn. He did not destroy. He unmade. And the more he unmade, the less the galaxy could explain. How could you track something that left no trace? How could you prepare for something you could not understand? The Jedi who remained grew desperate. They whispered of wound in the Force, of ancient prophecy, of exile and redemption. But Nihilus was not prophecy. He was aftermath. The result of choices they had all made. War, abandonment, silence. And now the silence had learned to speak. The galaxy would try to forget him. to erase his name from history, to bury the truth behind metaphors and teachings. But the Force remembers. It remembers Malachor. It remembers hunger. And somewhere in the darkest corners of the galaxy, it still listens for the voice that does not speak. Because that voice may one day speak again. It should not have flown. The Ravager had been destroyed in the final days of the Mandalorian Wars, torn apart above Malachor Vive by the same cataclysm that had broken everything else. Its structure was shattered, its systems offline, its crew long dead. But Nihilus did not need systems. He did not need engines or reactors or reason. He needed a place to carry his hunger. He stood alone in the wreckage. The ship groaned around him, steel and fire long forgotten. No light, no sound, just the emptiness of a battlefield that remembered nothing but death. And the Force bent in his presence. It reached into the twisted metal, into the shattered bulkheads and exposed bones of fallen soldiers, and it pulled, not to repair, to bind. Piece by piece, the Ravager came together again. Not as it was, but as a reflection of him. It did not fly by propulsion. It drifted, carried by currents of will and ruin. Its frame groaned with the echo of screams that had never left. There was no crew to command it. Only husks. Force sensitives enslaved by his presence, kept barely alive to anchor him to the physical world. They heard him in dreams. They obeyed without thought. Not out of devotion, but because to disobey meant to be noticed, and to be noticed meant to be consumed. The Ravager became an extension of his hunger, a vessel of death that did not seek conflict, only silence. It drifted across the stars like a shadow that refused to fade. Jedi outposts, Republic way stations, hidden colonies, all felt its pull before they saw its shape. And by then it was too late. Those who survived described the ship as a ghost, half there, half gone, holding together not with bolts or shields but with will alone. It had no warning systems, no announcements, no blasters drawn. It simply arrived, and the Force disappeared. Planets that had thrived in peace fell into confusion and decay. Not because they were attacked, but because something had passed overhead. Something that drained the very soul from the world beneath it. The Jedi could not track it. The Republic could not explain it. Because Nihilus did not fly the Ravager like a warlord. He haunted it. He sat deep within its broken heart, unmoving, unblinking, listening. Not to voices, but to presence. And when the hunger grew strong enough, the ship would move again. Sometimes it followed trade routes. Sometimes it chased whispers in the Force. But always, it moved toward life, and left nothing behind. This was not conquest. This was not war. It was erosion. The slow collapse of light across the stars, and at the center of it, a man who had forgotten he was ever alive. He did not command. He did not speak. He only sat. At the center of the Ravager's shattered bridge, in a chair that once belonged to a fleet admiral, Nihilus remained motionless. The throne was not built for him. It was built for a voice, a mind, a presence that could give orders and shape battles. But it no longer mattered, because there were no orders left to give. He had no need for strategy, no desire for conquest, no sense of victory or defeat. The throne became something else, a still point in the galaxy's septs turning, a monument to absence. Around him, the bridge crew moved like sleepwalkers, slaves caught in the current of his hunger. They were not Sith. They were not loyal. They were not even alive in the way most understood it. They obeyed, not because he demanded it, but because to be near him was to be undone slowly. Their eyes dulled, their minds faded, and as long as they kept moving, kept pressing buttons, kept pretending they were still crew, they were allowed to continue. not to live, just to exist, to orbit the gravity of his will. Some whispered that Nihilus still dreamed, that behind the mask he remembered fragments, names, voices, places long gone. But if he did, those memories never reached his body. He sat in silence, sometimes for hours, sometimes for weeks. And when the hunger rose, the crew would feel it before he moved. They would tremble, clutch their chests, fall to the floor in convulsions. And through that suffering, coordinates would be plotted. The Ravager would change course, and Nihilus would rise from the throne, not to speak, only to feed. To those who followed, he was not a Sith Lord. He was not even a being. He was ritual. He was gravity. A presence that could not be resisted or reasoned with. And the throne he sat upon, once a symbol of leadership, became a shrine. They left offerings around it, cloth, masks, pieces of bone. They prayed in silence, hoping the hunger would not notice them. But it always did. Eventually, because Nihilus did not sit to rule, he sat to wait. He waited for the next call, the next flicker of life in the galaxy bold enough to use the Force. He could feel it before it happened. A Jedi in meditation, a seer touching fate, a temple buried beneath trees whispering to the stars. And when that call came, the Ravager moved. Not fast, not with urgency, only with certainty. Because the hunger could not be stopped, and it could not be fooled. It knew where the Force lived, and it moved to where the Force would die. And still he sat. At the center of the galaxy sat slow collapse, a throne without a king without a soul. Kreia had always believed she could control him, that her will could guide his hunger, that through him she could wound the Force itself, strike at the very foundation of destiny. But power obeys no one, especially power born from emptiness. She had once seen Nihilus as a tool, a mirror of her own philosophy made manifest, that the Force was not divine, not balanced, not merciful. It was cruel. It used those who trusted it, and abandoned them when they had served their purpose. Nihilus was meant to be her vengeance, her proof, her final argument. But now, he was beyond her. He no longer sought her counsel. He no longer listened when she spoke. He no longer heard anything but the call of hunger. The more he fed, the stronger he became. And the stronger he became, the more the bond that connected them began to unravel. She could feel him slipping away, not in distance but in meaning. He was dissolving into the same void that had once threatened to consume her at Malachor. And yet she still believed she could reach him. She confronted him aboard the Ravager. The corridors moaned with the echo of her steps. Slaves bowed and fell silent as she passed. They knew her presence angered him. They could feel the weight in the air grow colder. When she entered the bridge, he did not turn. He sat on his throne, the mask reflecting the dim light of the dying consoles. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, softly, she spoke. "You were never meant to become this." The silence answered her. It was heavy, unyielding. She took a step forward. "You feed on the Force, but it is not the Force that binds the galaxy. It is memory, it is choice. You are undoing both." Still nothing. She reached out with the Force, not to attack but to feel what remained of him. And what she found was nothing, no presence, no thought. Only a gravity so immense it swallowed her senses. For the first time, Kreia hesitated. For the first time, she feared what she had created. When she pulled back, she spoke with something close to sorrow. "You were a wound in the Force, Nihilus, but now you are its silence." He rose slowly from the throne. The mask turned toward her. And though he said nothing, she heard his voice in her mind, a whisper without language, a plea without meaning. It was not anger. It was not obedience. It was hunger. The walls around them began to tremble. The enslaved screamed as the air grew thin. The Ravager itself groaned as if being drained. Kreia fell to her knees, her strength pulled from her in invisible threads. She tried to reach him again, to call his name. But he no longer had one. In that moment, she understood. She had not created an ally. She had created an ending. Sion had warned her. He had seen it coming. And now, her ambition had devoured her hope. She fled the Ravager before it tore itself apart around her. Her ship vanished into the void. Her connection to Nihilus was severed. And as she left, the last thread of control snapped. Nihilus no longer had a master. No longer had purpose. No longer had anything but the throne and the hunger that would never stop growing. The galaxy did not see a war. There were no invasions, no declarations, no fleets gathering in orbit. There was only the quiet, and then nothing. A world would fall silent. No distress calls, no survivors, only stillness where there had once been life. The Jedi tried to make sense of it. They scoured records, analyzed ruins, but nothing fit. No weapon known to the Order could do this. No Sith power matched the scale. Entire colonies erased, not destroyed, not bombed, not burned, just gone. Some began to speak of legends, of ancient rituals lost to time, of curses older than the Sith. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. It was Nihilus, alone, silent, hungering. The Ravager drifted from system to system, never following logic or pattern. It was not conquest, it was instinct. Nihilus fed on what called to him. The strong in the Force. The places where light still clung to life. Temples hidden in jungle moons. Jedi outposts buried in sand. Academies once thought forgotten. Wherever the Force gathered, he arrived. And when he left, the Force was no longer there. The few who survived spoke of a presence that could not be seen, only felt. A weight, a thinning, a breath that never reached the lungs. And above them, always the outline of a ship that should not fly, hanging in the sky like a scar. The Jedi gave up trying to fight him directly. Their blades meant nothing. Their power meant less. Because Nihilus did not fight. He consumed. And when he consumed, he grew stronger. His mask, once worn like a tether to identity, now floated above robes that barely touched flesh. His body had become suggestion, a shape built of will and hunger. Even the Force itself began to forget him. When Jedi Masters reached out to sense the flow of energy across the stars, they would skip past his presence, not because he was hiding, but because he was not there in the way the Force understood. He was a tear, a hole in the pattern, a whisper between lives. And that whisper was growing louder. The Republic refused to speak of him. The Council avoided his name, but they all felt him. Like pressure behind the eyes, like a storm forming at the edge of thought. It was not darkness. It was not death. It was what came after. The galaxy was dimming, and the Ravager drifted on, not toward victory, not toward a final battle, but toward silence. Endless, complete, hungering. And at its heart, a throne that no longer held a man. Only the Force set's forgotten mistake, the Lord of Hunger. The Sith Triumvirate was not built to last. It was not founded on trust. It was built on pain, on silence, on the belief that the Force had failed and must be punished for it. But pain fractures, silence isolates, and punishment always demands a victim. At first they moved in rhythm. 3 voices speaking one thought, to destroy the Jedi, not through battle, but by unraveling what they believed in. Sion hunted them with fury, Nihilus consumed them without emotion, and Kreia whispered doubts that made Jedi question the very meaning of the Force. It worked. The Order weakened, scattered, but in that quiet something else took root: doubt. Sion began to question Kreia Sep's motives. She spoke of ideas, of balance, of understanding, of reshaping the Force through philosophy. But Sion did not care for understanding. He only cared for survival. He lived in agony, every moment of every day. And Kreia Sep's words did not silence his pain. He began to believe she pitied him, that she saw him as a lesson, a tool, not a partner. He watched how she looked at Nihilus, not with fear, but with awe, as if the Hollow One was her true creation, as if he were the end she had always dreamed of. And Sion hated him for it. He hated how Nihilus never acknowledged her, how he fed on everything, even the bond between them. He saw Nihilus not as a Sith, but as a disease, and he began to wonder if the only way to stop the pain was to cut it out. Kreia sensed it. Of course she did. She had trained them both. She felt the rift before it became action, but she believed she could hold them together through force of will. She called them back to Malachor, to the Trajas Academy, to the place where all things had begun. She spoke of vision, of purpose, of what they were meant to be. But the silence that followed was not agreement. It was resistance. Nihilus said nothing, but his hunger pulsed louder than any word. Sion stepped forward, and Kreia saw it in his eyes. The moment he had chosen, she had thought betrayal would come from Nihilus, but it came from the one who had once begged for her guidance. Because Sion no longer saw her as a master. He saw her as a weakness. And Nihilus saw nothing at all. The Triumvirate had not fractured. It had simply remembered what it truly was. 3 blades, pointed inward. It began as silence, the kind that comes before something breaks. The corridors of the Trajas Academy whispered with unrest. Acolytes spoke in fragments. Servants vanished. Even the Force itself seemed uncertain of where to flow. The Triumvirate had turned inward. The shadow was devouring itself. Kreia stood in the lowest chamber, surrounded by the obsidian stone that had once been her temple. The air pulsed with the energy of Malachor, a deep, unending hum that had driven lesser beings to madness. To her it was home, but now it felt foreign, as if the planet itself were preparing to betray her. She could feel Nihilus above her. His presence was like a storm cloud that had forgotten how to reign. He no longer waited for her commands. He no longer listened at all. Through the Force, she could sense him feeding, draining those too weak to resist. He consumed without intention, without cruelty, without thought. A galaxy dying one whisper at a time. And somewhere beyond him, Sion was watching. He still obeyed her summons, still bowed when commanded. But his loyalty had curdled into resentment. He had begun to call himself immortal, a title built from hate. He no longer feared death because he could not die. His pain had become his reason to exist. And in his eyes, Kreia's teachings were nothing more than words. He believed she had abandoned the true path of the Sith. He said she had grown weak, that her philosophy had replaced her will. He began to whisper to Nihilus's followers, planting seeds of revolt. It did not take much. For those who served the Hungry One, belief meant nothing. They did not worship the dark, they feared it. And in fear, loyalty shifts easily. Kreia saw it unraveling, her great experiment collapsing from within. She had wanted to create something greater than the Sith, greater than the Jedi, a trinity that would break the chains of destiny itself. But she had underestimated what happens when you build power out of despair. Sion Sep's pain had made him blind. Nihilus Seth's hunger had made him deaf, and now her wisdom had made her alone. In the final days before it happened, Kreia confronted Sion in the training hall. The air shimmered with heat from the lightsabers around them, red and bright against the dark stone. He stared at her, scarred skin cracked, eyes alive with fury. "You have turned us into philosophers," he said. "We were meant to be gods." Kreia Seth's answer was calm. "Gods are slaves to their own creation, Sion. Only those who understand the Force can be free of it." He sneered, the sound almost a growl. "Freedom is for those who are strong enough to take it." The moment stretched thin. The Force trembled. Neither struck. Not yet, because both of them knew the fight had already begun long before blades would touch. Every word between them was a wound, every silence a death. When she turned to leave, he did not stop her, but in that stillness, their bond as master and student was gone. And above them Nihilus waited, listening, hungering, knowing the end of one would feed the rise of another. The Triumvirate was no longer united. It had become what all darkness eventually becomes, a war between shadows. It happened beneath the planet Sev's surface, in the same hollow that had once given birth to them all. The Treia's core, a place of endless echoes, where the walls breathed the Force, and the air was heavy with ancient death. Kreia stood alone before the great fissure, where molten light cut through black stone like veins of fire. She could feel the betrayal coming. She had felt it for weeks, but she did not run. She waited. The hum of the academy grew louder. It was not the sound of life, it was the sound of power, gathering, shifting, deciding. When Sion entered the chamber, he did not speak. He did not bow. He did not hide what he had come to do. Behind him came Nihilus, or what was left of him. He did not walk as a man walks. He drifted, a hollow specter wrapped in cloth, his mask glimmering with the faintest reflection of the core's crimson light. Kreia looked upon them both and knew her creation had become her grave. "You think this will save you," she said softly. Her voice did not tremble. "You believe that by killing me, you will destroy the weakness that binds you, but you are only killing yourselves." Sion Sept's voice cracked like the stone beneath them. "You taught me pain was strength. I have learned that lesson. I will prove it." Nihilus said nothing, but the Force began to thin. The air around them turned heavy. The light dimmed. Kreia could feel her strength bleeding from her veins, drawn into the void that was once her student. She raised her hand, and the stones beneath her feet rose in defiance. Energy coursed through the core, flaring against the darkness like lightning trapped in a cave. But every strike she made faded into Nihilus's hunger. Every word she spoke was lost in Sion Sept's rage. Her power was vast, but it was rooted in knowledge, and knowledge cannot fight emptiness. They moved together, the wounded body and the hollow soul, pain and hunger in perfect harmony. For a moment she thought she saw what the Force itself must see, the futility of balance, the endless cycle of teacher and student, creation and destruction, light and dark devouring each other forever. And then she fell, not defeated, unmade. Her lightsaber clattered against the stone, its crimson blade sputtering out as if the world itself had drawn its final breath. Sion stood over her, his cracked hands trembling. There was no triumph in his face, only exhaustion. He had killed the one person who had ever understood him, and Nihilus, silent, drifting beside him, did not care. The void pulsed once more. The air grew still, and what remained of Darth Kreia was swallowed by the same darkness she had once taught others to control. The Triumvirate was finished, but their story was not. Because in her fall, the galaxy did not lose a master. It gained something far worse, a hunger that no longer answered to anyone. When the echoes faded, Malachor was quiet again. Not peaceful, never peaceful, just quiet, the kind of quiet that follows tragedy too vast to name. The Trajas Academy lay in ruin. Its corridors, once alive with whispers of Sith doctrine and defiance, were now tombs. The air still vibrated with energy, but it no longer spoke her name. Kreia was gone. Not dead, not truly. She had been part of the wound for too long to vanish completely. But her presence, her guidance, her vision was scattered, like dust caught in the gravity of a dying star. Nihilus remained. He drifted through the ruins without thought, his mask reflecting the dim glow of the planet's core. To him, Kreia Set's fall was not victory. It was silence. Another piece of the Force swallowed and forgotten. Sion watched him go. The act that should have freed him instead hollowed him further. He had thought the death of his master would quiet the pain, but it only deepened it. Because without her, the pain had no meaning. For a time he lingered among the ruins, wandering the same halls they had once ruled together. He could still hear her voice, not in words, but in the faint vibrations that lived in the stone. Reminders that knowledge and power had failed her, and one day would fail him too. He left Malachor soon after. He needed distance, though distance meant nothing to a man who could not die. He fled not from enemies, but from the reflection of what he had become. Nihilus did not notice. He was already gone in spirit, already listening to the hum of other worlds waiting to be silenced. Malachor itself seemed to mourn. The storms grew louder. The fissures widened. Every tremor carried the memory of betrayal, not of love or loyalty, but of purpose. Because that was what had truly died that day. Not Kreia, not the Triumvirate. Purpose. The Sith had once believed in ambition, in the promise of dominance through understanding. But Nihilus had no such belief. He had no vision for the galaxy, no dream of order or empire, only need, only hunger. Kreia had feared this end. She had known that once her voice was gone, the Sith would lose direction. They would become what the Jedi always believed them to be: blind destroyers, slaves to their own emptiness. And Nihilus was the proof. When he left Malachor, the Ravager followed, drawn to him like a ghost to its master. The slaves aboard felt the shift, the weight, the cold. Something within the ship changed that day. It was as if Kreia's death had unlocked something deeper within him. His hunger grew sharper, his reach wider. From that moment on, he no longer needed to hunt for the Force. The Force came to him. Planets trembled when he awoke. Jedi enclaves fell silent without warning. And through it all, his mask remained still, an expressionless monument to what the dark side becomes when it forgets to desire anything but survival. Malachor became his shadow, a scar left open in the galaxy, still whispering in the voice of a teacher who would never return. And Nihilus, the hollow one, the echo, the wound made flesh, rose from that scar without a master, without a conscience, without end. He was not Sith. He was not man. He was what remained when betrayal became eternal. A god born from silence. A hunger that the Force itself could no longer contain. And somewhere, deep beneath the rubble of the Trajas core, the galaxy Set's oldest wound began to pulse again. It had lost its voice. But the silence was only the beginning. They knew he was coming, but they did not understand what he was. Katar was not a military base. It was a sanctuary, a place of quiet reflection, hidden deep in the mid-rim, chosen for its peace, its distance, its silence. The Jedi there were Mira Luca, a people without sight, who saw more than any other species ever could. They saw through the Force, not with eyes, but with understanding. They felt the rhythms of stars, the breath of light across distant galaxies. And when Nihilus moved, they felt it first. It began with tremors, not in the ground but in the currents of the Force itself. The pulse, a draining, like the warmth of a flame being taken before the cold had arrived. The masters on Qatar gathered. They did not panic. They meditated. They reached outward, and what they found was emptiness. Something vast, something hollow, moving through hyperspace like a wound given direction. The Ravager, the Jedi believed it was a Sith weapon, a super weapon, perhaps a ritual, perhaps even a remnant of Revan's war, finally returning to finish what had been started. They did not run. They did not hide. They believed that if they faced it together, they might understand it. That through understanding, there might be peace. But Nihilus did not speak. He did not land. He did not invade. He arrived. The Ravager entered orbit without warning. Its shadow passed over Qatar like a storm cloud that had forgotten how to rain. There were no transmissions, no weapons fire, no explosions. Just a moment, a breath, and then nothing. The Force screamed, once, loud enough to be heard across systems, and then fell silent. In seconds the Jedi were gone. Every last one, their bodies untouched, their temples still standing, but their presence, their connection to the Force gone as if it had never been there at all. When a Republic scout vessel arrived days later, they found a planet frozen in time, meals still steaming on tables, lights still glowing in meditation halls, children asleep in classrooms. None of them had woken up, and none of them ever would. Some called it sorcery, others called it genocide, but no one could explain how it had been done. There were no toxins, no diseases, no signs of energy weapons, only the absence, a void that spread out from the center of the enclave like a stone dropped in still water, and at the heart of it, an emptiness that still hummed through the rock. The Jedi Council fell into silence. The few who could still sense the Force at long distances spoke of a disturbance, as if a star had gone out in their minds. But it had not gone out. It had been consumed, and the one who consumed it was not finished. Qatar was only the beginning, because Nihilus had learned something. He did not need to find Jedi. He only needed to find the Force. And the Force was everywhere. The galaxy began to whisper, first in fear, then in disbelief, and finally in silence. A single name moved through those whispers, Nihilus, but it was not spoken as the name of a man. It was spoken like a warning, like a plague that traveled not through air or blood, but through the very current of the Force itself. No one truly saw him. Only what came after. Dead worlds, hollow moons, empty ships still drifting through orbit, their crews still seated, their faces calm, as if death had come to them in their sleep. Nihilus did not plan his attacks. He did not choose targets out of strategy or vengeance. He was drawn to them, like gravity, like instinct. Every time a Jedi reached out through the Force, every time a planet set's life thrummed too loudly, he heard it, and the hunger turned toward it. It was no longer something he could control, not even something he seemed to understand. Each time he fed, his strength grew, but so did the need. It was endless. The more he devoured, the more he starved. The larger his reach became, the more his body crumbled. Those who glimpsed him aboard the Ravager said he was barely flesh, a shape more shadow than substance, a presence bound together by will alone. The mask had become his face. the robes his only form, and beneath them, there was nothing. His hunger reached across hyperspace now. Entire systems began to dim before he arrived. The Force itself recoiled, as if it were learning to fear one of its own. He could feel life through walls of stone and oceans of air, and when he focused, he could draw that life toward him, pulling it out of bodies, out of minds, out of the very air that sustained them. Worlds died in moments, not with fire or war, but with breath. One breath. The Jedi enclave on Katar had been the first, but then came others. Places the records would never name. Settlements that vanished without a trace. Those who felt him coming would sometimes try to flee. Boarding ships, leaving orbit, trying to escape the invisible tide. But Nihilus was not chasing them. He was following the Force that lived within them, and wherever the Force went, he could find it. He was not alive in the way life is understood. He did not need food or water or air. He did not need rest. He did not even need time. He existed only between hunger and silence. The Force had become his body, his voice, his weapon, and in some forgotten way, his prison. There were moments, brief, fleeting, where he seemed to remember what it meant to be alive. When he stood before worlds filled with life, he would hesitate for the smallest fraction of a moment, as if something inside him recognized the beauty of what he was about to erase. But then the hunger would return, and the hesitation would vanish. There was no joy in it, no pleasure, no satisfaction. Only relief, like scratching a wound that never heals. And when the silence settled, he would drift again, empty, waiting for the next call of the Force. To some, he was a monster. To others, a god. But neither description was true. He was simply what remained, when power forgot to care what it destroyed. There are moments in galactic history that the Force itself remembers. Moments when something shifts so deeply that even time holds its breath. The fall of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, the death of Revan, the burning of Ossus, and then there was Katar. But Katar was not remembered because of battle. It was remembered because of absence, because on that day the Force went quiet. For centuries, Jedi had spoken of the Force as sound, music, harmony, a current that hummed through all things. But after Katar, it changed. Across the galaxy, masters meditating in solitude felt it first, a sudden weight in their chests, a sense that something vast and eternal had exhaled and forgotten to inhale again. Some called it imbalance, others thought it was prophecy, but none of them understood that it was hunger, a hunger so vast it had devoured the song of life itself. There were survivors on Katar, a handful who had been off-world when Nihilus came. When they returned, they walked through their city like ghosts. They found families still seated around tables, hands clasped, eyes closed. No wounds, no decay, just stillness. When one of them, a young Miraluka named Visas Ma, reached out with the Force, she felt nothing. No light, no dark, no life, only an echo, a vibration in the void, a shadow where the Force should have been. And then she felt him. The voice came not in words, but in need. A pulse so deep that her mind shattered before she could understand it. In a single moment she was bound to him, a survivor made servant, to her sight stolen and replaced with something else. Nihilus had not killed her. He had marked her. Through her, the galaxy would soon learn what he had become. Visas would later describe him not as a man, but as a wound given shape, a being so hollow that even the Force could not flow through him without vanishing. And through that hollow he spoke, not in sound, but in hunger. Every word a vibration of need, every command a wave that stripped away thought. He called her through the dark, and she came. She boarded the Ravager, drawn not by will, but by gravity, the same pull that the Force itself could not escape. When she arrived, she fell to her knees before the throne. Not in devotion, but in surrender. She could feel the death that filled the ship. Thousands of voices, each one a memory of life that no longer existed. And at the center of it all, Nihilus. He reached toward her, and for the first time since Kata, she heard something. A heartbeat. His, or maybe her own. She could not tell. The sound lasted only a moment before it was swallowed by silence. From that moment on, Visas Ma was no longer a Jedi, no longer a Miraluka. She was the echo of his will. His eyes, his voice when words were needed. Through her, Nihilus began to move again. Not as a man leading an army, but as a void guiding shadows. She would later say she pitied him, that behind the mask, she could still feel a soul trapped in its own hunger. But pity does not save a galaxy, and Nihilus could not be saved, because on that day, the day the Force went silent, he stopped being a wound. He became the emptiness itself. The legends came slowly, whispers at first, buried in forgotten systems, passed in hushed voices aboard refugee ships. No records, no evidence, only patterns. A planet would vanish from trade routes. Its communications would stop. And when scouts arrived, they found nothing. Cities untouched. Ships still docked. No signs of war, just silence. And one word, spoken too quietly to echo. Nihilus. The Jedi tried to understand it. They studied ruins, retraced hyperspace lanes. They gathered Force sensitives who had survived brushes with the darkness. And the stories always returned to the same image. A figure in black robes, a mask that floated where a face should be. A shadow that left no footprints. Some said he could be reasoned with, that behind the mask was a man once wounded, once righteous, a remnant of revenge-stess war, a soul who had fallen too far. But others knew the truth. There was no one left behind the mask. There was no face, no voice, only hunger. And that mask, simple, curved, pale against the void, had become a symbol, not of power, not of fear, but of finality, because when that mask appeared in the sky, there was nothing to fight. No army to defeat, no negotiation to hold, only the knowledge that everything was already gone. Some Jedi believed he was the Force's punishment, a balance to centuries of pride. Others believed he was the Force's failure made flesh, but neither belief mattered, because Nihilus did not care. He did not conquer. He did not demand. He simply arrived and consumed. And the more he consumed, the less he remembered. Not just faces, not just names, but purpose, meaning, time. He drifted now, led by whispers in the Force, drawn to planets the galaxy had forgotten, places where life still shimmered barely, and still he fed, one breath at a time. There were worlds that never made it to the archives, whole civilizations that vanished in seconds, too distant to cry out, too small to be missed, and above them the Ravager, held together by will, guided by silence, haunted by a mask that never blinked. There were no battles, no victories, only absence. Jedi Masters tried to sense his coming. They failed, because Nihilus was no longer part of the Force in any way they understood. He had become the shadow between the stars, a ripple in the current that unmade rather than disturbed. He was not darkness. He was not death. He was what remained when the Force stopped speaking, and the galaxy, exhausted from war, from prophecy, from betrayal, had no strength left to resist him. They buried his name, erased his image from records, refused to teach what had happened. Because memory has power, and Nihilus had once been memory, but now he was legend. And legends cannot be reasoned with, they can only be feared. So the galaxy forgot, and Nihilus faded again, not into history, but into myth. But somewhere, in the silence between stars, in the tremor before a breath, in the cold echo that follows every death in the Force, he remains, still hungry, still drifting, still listening. The mask that devoured the galaxy has not yet finished. She did not scream when her world died. She did not run. She did not hide, because there was nothing left to run from, and nothing left to run to. Visas Ma was Miraluka, born without eyes, but never blind. Her people saw through the Force, each movement in the galaxy a ripple of light across their minds. Qatar had been her sanctuary, a world of silence, of stillness, of clarity. The Jedi had taught her that through the Force all things could be known, and all pain could be understood. But the Force had not prepared her for Nihilus. She felt him before she heard him, before she even knew he had a name. A cold that cut through her mind, a weight that pushed against her soul. And then in a single breath, everything vanished. The temple fell silent. The masters were gone. The light, all of it, extinguished. Her vision did not fade. It shattered. The Force, once a symphony of stars, became a void, soundless, colorless, dead. And yet, she remained, alone, alive, and empty. When she opened her mind again, there was only one thing left, him. He did not speak. He did not offer mercy. He did not explain, but he reached for her through the Force, not with anger, not even with purpose, only hunger. And she felt herself pulled toward him, drawn like ash into fire. She did not remember boarding the ship. She did not remember leaving Qatar. But when she awoke again, she was on the Ravager. The air was thick. The walls hummed with death. The crew were shadows, silent, blind, obedient. And in the center of it all, Nihilus. He did not turn when she entered. He did not acknowledge her. But he felt her, and in that feeling, she understood. She had survived not by mistake, but by design. He had left her alive, because she still had something to give. Not power, not strength, not resistance. He had taken everything from her, her people, her sight, her faith in the Force. And in that ruin, he had made a place for her. She was no longer Jedi, no longer Miraluka. She was his, and she would follow. Not because she believed in him, but because she had nowhere else left to go. He never spoke, not in words, not in breath, and yet she heard him. In the quiet between footsteps, in the stillness before a planet died, in the shiver of the Force that trembled beneath her skin. Nihilus did not give commands. He pressed his will forward like gravity. And she, bound to him, followed. Visas Ma became his voice. Not because she chose to, but because the alternative was worse. To be near him was to feel yourself being pulled apart, your thoughts unwinding, your memories drained. Only by surrendering, by giving herself fully to the current, could she survive the weight. And so she spoke where he could not. She answered for him, delivered his warnings, carried his presence into rooms where his hunger would kill too quickly. To many, she appeared Sith, but she was not. She was an echo, his translator, his reflection, his last remaining tether to a world that used to breathe. She began to understand how he moved, not by logic or design, but by need, like a dying star reaching for the last light it could pull into itself. She stood at his side on silent bridges, walked with him through hollow ships and ruined temples, watched as he consumed life without lifting a hand, and she listened. Not to words, but to rhythm, to the silence that followed each death, to the whisper that lived behind the hunger. There was no pleasure in him, no cruelty, no anger, only emptiness. And in that emptiness, she began to feel something strange. Not hatred, not fear, but grief. Not her own. His. Somewhere within that mask, something had been lost, and in losing it, he had lost the need to be anything at all. She wondered what his name had once been. What voice had once spoken through that body? What choice had led him here? But when she searched him through the Force, she found no answer. Only need, only void. And still, she followed, because to stop moving was to be consumed, and she was not ready to disappear. Not yet. She did not know how much time had passed. Days, weeks, years. On the Ravager, time had no meaning. The ship drifted through space like a wound that refused to close, and she drifted with it. She no longer slept. Not in the way she once did. When she closed her mind, she could still feel the hum of the void, the pull of the hunger that never stopped. It was alive. It was constant. And she was tied to it. She watched him move from world to world. He never spoke a destination, but she always knew where they would go. She could feel it before it happened. The tremor in the Force, the subtle cry of life that called to him. He would stand on the bridge, motionless, as the ship descended over each world. She would stand behind him, a shadow behind a shadow. And when he fed, she felt it. It was like drowning in whispers. Every life on the surface crying out in the Force, and then vanishing, one after another, until there was only silence. The first time she witnessed it, she fell to her knees, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of it, the Force itself bending beneath his will. But as time passed, the horror faded into numbness. The pain became routine. She learned to breathe through it, to feel the waves of death without collapsing, because someone had to. Someone had to remember what was being lost, and somewhere deep inside, she began to pity him. He did not feed out of cruelty. He did not kill for pleasure. He fed because he had to, because the hunger was all that was left. There were moments, brief, fleeting, when he would turn his head, and she would feel something beneath the mask. A flicker of memory, of recognition. As if for one heartbeat, he remembered what it was like to exist. But then it would fade. The hunger would rise again, and the moment would die. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to strike him down, to end the emptiness that followed him everywhere. But she could not, because she saw what others could not. He was not a man anymore, not even a Sith. He was a wound that had learned to walk, a hole in the Force that wore the memory of flesh, and she, his last living servant, was bound to that wound. Sometimes she wondered if the Force had kept her alive for a reason, perhaps to witness, perhaps to understand, or perhaps to remind the galaxy that even monsters were once people. She no longer prayed, but in the long hours of silence between worlds, she would whisper to herself, to whatever fragments of the Force still listened, "Let this end, please, let this end." It began quietly, not with anger, not with vengeance, just a question. She had been so long in the dark, so long wrapped in his shadow, that she had forgotten what it meant to wonder. But one day, as the Ravager drifted near a lifeless moon, she stood on the bridge and asked the silence, "What are we now?" Nihilus did not answer. He never did. But she felt the echo of his presence, curved inward like a dying star. He did not hear her words. He only heard her life. And in that moment, she realized something terrifying. He did not even know her name. She had spoken for him, served him, walked beside him through death. But to him, she was just another voice in the Force, a sound to be devoured when the hunger grew too loud. And that was when it bloomed. Not rebellion, not hatred, but defiance. Not loud, not violent, just a quiet truth that formed at the edge of her soul. I will not vanish, she thought. I will not be forgotten like the rest. She began to meditate again, softly, secretly. She reached out to the Force, weak as it had become. She searched the edges of her mind for something that was hers alone. And when she found it, it did not roar. It whispered. A single image. A Jedi exile. Someone who had walked away from the Council. Someone who, like her, had survived a wound in the Force. The moment she felt him, Nihilus stirred, not in anger, in instinct. He sensed the same presence she did, and like a beast starving in the dark, he turned toward it. The hunger had found a target, but for Visas Ma, this was something else. Hope, not for salvation, not even for survival. Hope for meaning, hope for an end. She knew what she had to do. She did not know if she would live. She did not know if she could escape him. But she knew this: if Nihilus reached the exile, he would consume more than just a person. He would devour a wound in the Force so deep, so rare, that even he might not survive it. Perhaps that was what she wanted. Not justice, not revenge, but balance. And so she left. Not in the dead of night, not in secrecy. She simply walked away. Not because he let her, because he did not care. She was no longer enough to feed the void. And in that moment, she became free. She would meet the exile. She would offer her truth. And together, perhaps, they could become the silence that ended the scream. Because even the deepest hunger cannot consume everything. Not if someone remembers. Not if someone resists. Not if someone loves. She was not supposed to return. Mitra Surik had been exiled, not just from the Jedi, but from the very rhythm of the galaxy. Her presence had once changed the course of a war. Now it barely moved the air. The galaxy had forgotten her name, but the wound she carried had not healed. It whispered to her at night. It followed her through hyperspace. It lived in her chest, where the Force should have been. She was not like other Jedi. Because she had made a choice they would never understand. She had obeyed Revan, stood at Malachor V, watched as a superweapon torn from Mandalorian ruins unraveled a battlefield full of life. And she had lived through it, felt the Force scream, felt it die. And somehow she survived the silence. The Jedi called her wound unnatural. The Council had named her dangerous, a threat to the Order itself. But they never asked what she had seen. They never asked what she had felt. Because they feared the truth. Mitra Surik had not just walked away from the Force. She had severed herself from it. It was the only way she could live. Years passed. The Republic rebuilt. The Mandalorians vanished into the stars. And the Jedi grew quiet. Some had disappeared. Others had simply died. The Order was fading, like the breath of something already gone. That was when she returned. Not to reclaim a place, not to seek forgiveness. She had no illusions left. She came back because she felt it. A tremor, a wrongness. Something hungry, rising in the places where the Force should have been. Planets, not invaded, but emptied. Voices, not silenced, but erased. The galaxy did not know the word for it, but she did. It was the same presence she had felt at Malachor V, the same scream, the same silence. But this time it had a shape. Somewhere in the dark, another wound had survived, and it had grown, fed on the suffering of others, devoured the very essence of life. It did not speak. It did not negotiate. It consumed. She did not know its name yet, but she would. She began to search. Not with ships, not with armies, with memory, with instinct, with the feeling in her chest that pulled tighter every time she neared a planet gone quiet. Telos, Onderon, Dantooine, echoes. That was all that remained. And in those echoes, she heard something else. A girl's voice, soft, wounded, but still alive. Visa's Ma, the one who had survived Nihilus, the one who had seen him, not with eyes but with the Force, and chosen to live. She found Visa's not as an enemy, not as a prisoner, but as a mirror. The two women sat together in silence, and in that silence something passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. Both had been broken. Both had served something larger than themselves. Both had been told to forget who they were, and neither had. In Visa Sift's words, Mitra heard the hunger. Not just its power, its loneliness, its pain. And for the first time, she understood. The thing that waited in the dark was not a Sith. Not truly. It was a shadow left behind by someone who had died screaming. And it was calling to her, because only someone like her could end it. The Jedi could not feel it. The Republic could not see it, but she could. Because it was made from the same silence that lived in her, she did not prepare for war. She did not gather armies. She simply kept walking, step by step, system by system, toward the final wound in the Force. She was not a hero. She was not a savior. She was the last remnant of a broken war, and she was going to meet the thing it left behind. He had no face, but she knew him. She had never stood before Darth Nihilus, but the moment they met, her body recognized him. Her wound pulsed, her breath caught, and the Force recoiled. Not from hatred, from recognition. Because she was not facing a man, she was facing a reflection. His armor shifted like the folds of a dead flag. The mask, broken and red, floated where a face should be. And behind it, nothing. Not a voice, not a presence, only gravity. He pulled at the Force like a collapsing star, and she could feel herself unraveling. Not from fear, but from memory. He had once been like her. Not just wounded, but abandoned. Left behind at Malachor, where the Force itself had cried out and then fallen silent. She had walked away. He had stayed. That was the only difference. And yet, it had made them into opposites. She survived the wound by sealing it shut. He survived by letting it grow. And now, that hunger filled him. Not with rage, but with need. He did not strike. He did not threaten. He did not even look at her. Because Darth Nihilus did not see people. He saw sources, lights waiting to be extinguished, mouths still breathing, Force signatures ready to be consumed. And to him, Mitra Surik was not a Jedi, not an exile. She was the largest flame in the room, the only one that had tasted the same silence and survived. He reached for her. Not with his hands, they were still. He reached through the Force, pulse, and she felt herself slipping. Her past, her doubts, her guilt, they rose to the surface like blood in water. She could feel the weight of every soul she had left behind. The Mandalorians she had killed, the Jedi who had turned away from her, the friends who had vanished into dust. It all surged toward him. And still, he said nothing. Because that was his power. He did not argue. He did not persuade. He made others forget they had the right to resist. Mitra stood alone. Not because no one had come with her, but because this moment was not for armies. It was for wounds, and her wound refused to close. She fell to her knees. The force buckled around her, and in that collapse she saw it. A flicker, a memory that was not hers. She saw a boy on a battlefield, burnt, starving, screaming through the dust, not for help, but for silence. She saw Malachor again, not as she had remembered it, but as he had lived it. The bodies, the ash, the sound of minds breaking apart, the vacuum left behind when millions of voices vanished in an instant. He had been there, not as a warrior, but as someone who stayed too long. He had looked into the wound, and the wound had looked back. She felt his pain, and in that pain was nothing. Nothing left to live for. Nothing left to believe in. Nothing left to feel. Only hunger. Because hunger was simple. Hunger never judged. Hunger never betrayed. It just needed to be fed. And so, that was what he became. Not a Sith Lord. Not a conqueror. Not even a man. Just a wound that had learned how to walk. She staggered back, her breath shallow, her body trembling, not because she feared him, but because she understood him, and that was far more dangerous. Because to understand Darth Nihilus was to feel the temptation he carried, to let go, to give in, to forget who you once were, and just feed. But she did not fall, because something inside her was still alive. A voice, small, wounded, but clear. You are not him. And that voice was hers. There was no battle cry, no exchange of threats, no sound but the hum of breath and force. The room was silent, but the force screamed. Mitra rose slowly, her eyes steady, not with anger, not with courage, but with grief. This was not a duel. This was a test. She had trained to defend the Republic. She had learned from the Jedi to serve peace. But no one had prepared her for this. Because Darth Nihilus was not alive. He was not fighting to win. He was feeding to survive. And that made him unstoppable. He moved, not with speed, but with certainty. His presence surged like a wave of death. He raised no lightsaber. He needed none. He reached with the Force, and she felt her vision flicker. The walls bent, the air vanished, and her thoughts were no longer hers. He was inside her past, her regrets, her guilt, the Jedi she let die, the Mandalorians she helped destroy, the council that exiled her. He pressed down on all of it, feeding, not just on power, but on memory. Because to him memory was a weakness, and weakness was flavor. She cried out, not aloud, but into the Force. Not in fear, but in resistance, and for the first time, Darth Nihilus paused. Something pushed back. Not rage, not hate, but something deeper, something that had no name. She remembered who she was. Not a Jedi, not a warrior, not a wound, just a person who had made a choice. And that choice was this: to feel, even if it hurt, even if it broke her. Because to feel was to be alive. He lunged forward, not his body, but his hunger. The room dimmed, the Force fractured, and her lungs began to close. She was being unraveled, but she held the center. She remembered the friends who still stood by her, the ones who had fallen because of her, and the one who had once trained her, and fallen further than any. Reben. She had followed him once. Now she faced a shadow darker than his. Darth Nihilus struck again, but this time she saw the pattern. His power was not rage. It was not strength. It was absence. He did not pull from the Force. He consumed the space around it, like a parasite, like gravity. He did not live. He eroded, and erosion had no will of its own. She stepped forward. He recoiled, not physically, but something shifted. The Force bent in her favor, because she was not feeding, she was holding. And in that balance, his weakness was revealed. He could only devour what surrendered. She did not. And for the first time, Darth Nihilus faltered. His mask cracked, not on the surface, but in the Force. There was confusion. He had never been denied. Not by Jedi, not by masters, not by fleets. But now, a lone exile stood before him, and he could not take her. She did not strike. Not yet. She waited, to see if there was anything left of him. A whisper, a flicker, anything. But there was only the void. No scream, no plea, no regret, only hunger. And hunger could not change. It could only consume. So she raised her blade, not in vengeance, but in mercy. The battle ended not with fury, but with silence. The silence of what had already died. Long before the blade reached him, there was no body. When the blade cut through him, there was no scream, no flesh torn, no armor falling apart. There was only dust, and a whisper of wind that should not have been there. The Sith Lord, known as Darth Nihilus, did not fall. He faded, and the last thing to remain was the mask. It struck the ground softly, not with weight, but with memory. It did not belong to a face. It had not in a very long time. The Force grew quiet, like a room after a long cry, like the silence when someone you love finally stops breathing. Visa's Ma stepped forward. Her hands did not tremble. She had known this would happen, but knowing did not protect the heart. She lowered her head and knelt. She did not weep. Her people had no eyes. But what they saw in the Force was brighter than any color and heavier than any tear. Mitra watched her closely. The Jedi exile had not come for revenge. She had not come for closure, only for understanding. And now, standing in the echo of his end, she felt none. The hunger had stopped, but the wound remained. Because Darth Nihilus had never truly lived. He had never been healed, only hidden. Visas picked up the mask, and in that moment, Mitra felt it, a whisper through the Force. Not words, not memory, just a cold presence, flickering, and then gone. No last thoughts, no redemption, no scream, because there was nothing left to save. But there had been something once, a man, a soldier, a Jedi, someone who had fought at Malachor, someone who had survived what no one else could, and in surviving, had become something worse than death. His name was lost, burned away by the power he fed on, by the mask he wore. And yet, Mitra could not help but wonder if somewhere in that endless hunger there had once been a whisper for help, one the galaxy had never heard, because he had never spoken it. He had only devoured, and in doing so, he had become the very thing the Jedi feared most, a being so far gone, so empty, so powerful, that even death was not a release, only a delay. The Sith Lords who followed him would forget his face, but they would never forget his silence, because silence was his legacy. Visas stood and placed the mask down on the cold floor. Not in anger, not in hate, but in mourning. She had been his voice, and now she had no one left to speak for. Mitra walked away, not victorious, not whole, only quieter, because she had seen what she could have become, and she had ended it. Not out of strength, but out of mercy. The Ebon Hawk waited in the hangar, its lights dim, its engines cold, but behind her, in the heart of the Sith warship, a mask sat untouched. And even now, with no presence left inside it, the Force still recoiled, because it remembered. It remembered the one who had fed on entire worlds, who had spoken no words, and who had died with no name, only a title, Darth Nihilus, the Lord of Hunger. And even in death, his story would echo, not as a warning, but as a question. What happens when a soul breaks so deeply that the only way to feel is to make others disappear? There are places in the galaxy where the Force does not whisper, it screams. The Ravager was one of those places. Once a capital ship in the Mandalorian fleet, it had died over Malachor V, its hull split open by mass shadows, its engines torn apart by gravity fields. But, like everything touched by that wound, it did not stay dead. Nihilus raised it from the grave, not with hands, but with hunger. Its shattered skeleton drifted above Tellus like a ghost with no tether, held together not by metal, but by the will of one being. And even that will was beginning to unravel. Inside the ship, there was no hum of power, no sense of life. Every corridor was empty. Every surface felt brittle, as though it might disintegrate if touched. The very walls breathed with starvation. It was not a vessel, it was a reflection of the being who now waited in silence, surrounded by echoes of the lives he had consumed. Darth Nihilus did not move. He sat upon the blackened remains of a command throne, facing nothing, staring at a viewport that showed only static. The stars beyond did not comfort him. He had forgotten what light meant, forgotten what time was. What had once been a man was now only an outline of robes and shadow, a shape crowned by a white mask cracked down the center. Behind it, there were no eyes, only absence, only the hunger that had fed on entire planets. He did not feel fear, he did not feel hope, he felt the tremor. A ripple in the Force, like the memory of a voice long forgotten. It was coming closer, drawing a line through space and time, and he recognized it, not as an enemy, but as a reflection. Another wound, another echo from Malachor. Mitra Surik. He remembered her not by face, but by silence. She had stood at Malachor's edge when the mass shadow generator was fired. She had walked away from the Jedi, carrying the wound inside her. Like him, she had heard the silence in the Force. But unlike him, she had listened. She did not devour to fill it, she stood inside it and endured. That was why she could come here. That was why her presence now pressed against the Ravager like a slow breath, calm but inevitable. Her ship approached, carried by quiet resolve, untouched by fear. She had not come to kill him. She had come to end what remained. As the Ravager's sensors flickered to life, detecting the intrusion, the few living beings left aboard stirred. Sith assassins, pale shadows warped by the dark side, moved to intercept, but even they knew it was futile. Their master had stopped commanding them. They were not protectors, they were remnants. And remnants could not stand against purpose. In the ship's lower decks, Visa's Ma stood alone. She had felt it too. The approach of the one she had once tried to destroy, the Jedi who had spared her, Mitra. Her presence was not an attack, it was a remembrance, a tether pulling them both back to where it all began. Visas knew what would happen next. She knew her master would try to feed, and she knew this time he would fail. Above on the bridge, the hollow shape in the throne finally moved, a shift in the folds of his robe, a faint tightening of the mask's edges. There was no breath, yet the air grew heavy. The hunger stirred, not with rage, but with recognition. This was not another world, not another nameless voice to silence. This was the last mirror. As Mitra stepped aboard the Ravager, the force between them stretched thin. The silence of Malachur, it had returned, but this time it was not empty. It was waiting to be answered. And deep inside what remained of Darth Nihilus, something flickered. Not fear, not thought, just resistance. A memory of being whole, of not needing to consume. He did not understand it, but he would not ignore it. Not here, not now. Not as the final wound walked through his shattered gates to look into the face of what she could have become. The Ravager did not echo with alarms, it echoed with memory. Mitra moved through its corridors like a whisper through a dead forest. Her boots made no sound. Her breath did not quicken. She did not flinch at the skeletal remains of Sith that lined the walls, twisted by their own rituals. She had seen worse. She had caused worse. And she had survived. That was why she had come. She was not here to strike a blow for the Republic, not to avenge the Jedi, not to restore balance. She was here to face the last voice of Malachor and silence it. The bridge loomed ahead, veiled by broken doors, flickering lights, and the last veil of the Force. It was there she felt him most clearly. Darth Nihilus. But the closer she drew, the more she understood something had changed. His hunger did not rush to meet her. It did not claw at her presence. It watched her, like a fire too weak to leap but too proud to die. There was no rage, only waiting. She remembered his presence at Qatar, a scream so vast it had erased an entire world. But now, that scream trembled, not from weakness, but from recognition. He knew who she was. She stepped onto the bridge with her saber unlit. Nihilus stood before her, not seated now, but rising slowly, robes flowing like oil in water. The cracked white mask faced her, motionless yet heavy with weight. Behind it, the Force pulsed. It pushed at her, not to kill, but to understand. Then the hunger reached. It was not an attack, it was instinct. Like a starved beast that did not know another way. The dark side rushed forward, silent and cold, trying to wrap itself around her soul, to feed, to erase. But Mitra did not resist with power. She resisted with nothing. Not emptiness, not the void. She opened the wound inside her, the same one he carried, and let it show him what he had forgotten, what he had thrown away, not strength. Not anger, but grief. She showed him Malachor. Not as a wound to feed upon, but as a scar that never healed. And for the first time, he stopped feeding. The pressure dropped. The darkness hesitated. He staggered backward. Something inside him cracked, not his mask, but the illusion beneath it. He was not a god, he was a man, a broken soul who had once screamed at the edge of a dying planet. And the scream had never ended. It had only grown louder, until now. Because in front of him stood someone who had carried the same silence and survived it. She did not shout. She did not strike. She simply stepped forward, and he stepped back. Not in fear, but in recognition. He remembered his name. He remembered being alive. The hunger tried again. But now it was different. Desperate, uncertain, like a child reaching for something it could no longer hold. And when it touched her again, it found no fear. Only resolve. Only stillness. That was the moment the Ravager shook. Not from battle, but from balance. The wound in the Force met its mirror, and instead of collapse, there was pause. The galaxy held its breath. And for the first time since Malachor, Nihilus felt something break, not around him, but within. He dropped to one knee. The hunger howled, but he did not rise, because there was nothing left to rise for. He had consumed entire worlds, and in all of them, he had never found peace. only silence. Now that silence looked him in the face and forgave him. She did not destroy him. He began to destroy himself. He could feel it happening. Not outside him, within. The Force, the same current he had devoured for centuries, began to turn against him. It no longer obeyed. It no longer fed him. It remembered what he had done, and it began to take him back. Darth Nihilus staggered, the folds of his robe trembling in the vacuum of silence that surrounded them. He reached out, not to attack, not to consume, but to hold on to something, anything. But there was nothing to hold, because he had eaten it all. Every world, every voice, every fragment of life that might have saved him. And now, with nothing left to feed upon, his power began to fold inward, collapsing in on itself, like a dying star. The Ravager trembled. Its decks moaned as if remembering every death that had taken place within them. The crew, what remained of them, fell where they stood, their bodies unmade by the same hunger that was devouring its master. Visa's Ma felt it first. From her position below the bridge, she sensed the fracture, the unraveling of the presence that had once filled her mind like a black sea. She staggered, clutching the walls, whispering through the Force, "My master, what have you done?" But he did not hear her. He could not. He no longer heard anything. On the bridge, Mitra did not strike. Her blade hung loose at her side, still unlit. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried sorrow. This was not victory. This was witnessing. She felt the weight of every soul he had taken. Every scream that had been swallowed. Every planet that had gone silent because of the wound he carried. And in the center of it all, a man. Alone. Terrified. He had never wanted this. Not at the beginning. He had been a survivor, not a monster. But the wound at Malachor had whispered, and he had listened. The darkness had promised him relief, power, escape from the pain. It had given him all of it, and then taken everything in return. Now, as the hunger tore at itself, he tried to speak. For the first time in centuries, he tried to speak. But there was no voice, only soundless breath. Only air that could no longer remember how to shape words. His mask turned slightly toward her. Not in hatred. Not in defiance. In recognition. The Force between them flickered, dim, then bright, then dim again. She stepped closer. And the hunger, weak but still alive, reached for her one last time. It brushed against her thoughts. And in that instant, she saw everything. The battlefield. The faces. The burning sky above Malachor Fury. She saw him. A man standing at the edge of the wound, unable to look away. He had stayed when the others had fled. He had felt the pain of millions die all at once. And it had broken him. That was who he had been. That was who Darth Nihilus truly was. Not a god. Not a destroyer. Just a man who had lost the ability to bear the sound of living. She whispered, not through lips, but through the Force. "I understand." The mask trembled. For a moment, it seemed to look down, as if in shame. And then the cracking began. Not loud, not violent, soft, like ice breaking under slow heat. The fractures spread from the center outward, thin white lines of light cutting across the surface. The sound was not a scream, it was a sigh. The Ravager groaned. Its power flickered. The air shifted, weightless. The hunger began to collapse, no longer seeking, no longer devouring, only caving inward. Nihilus fell to his knees. His robes pooled around him, like the shadows of a dying sun. His head bowed low. And the mask, that mask which had hidden him for so long, finally broke. It did not shatter. It fell apart gently. The pieces turned to dust before they touched the floor. And beneath it, there was nothing. No face, no flesh, no life. Only a fading echo disappearing into the quiet. Visas entered the bridge at last. She stopped at the threshold, unable to move. Her master was gone. But the wound in the Force still lingered. Mitra turned to her slowly, as if afraid to disturb the silence. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Because both of them knew what had just died. Not a Sith. Not a legend. A memory too hungry to fade, too broken to heal. And with his final breath, the galaxy felt lighter, but emptier. The Ravager did not explode. It drifted, a fortress of steel, bone, and silence, slowly losing its shape against the stars. Without a master to command it, the ship became a tomb. No alarms, no escape pods, no power, just stillness. Mitra Surik stood at the heart of it, eyes closed, breathing steady, waiting for the wound to stop whispering. But it never truly did. Darth Nihilus was gone, yet part of him remained, not in the Force, but in the space the Force could not touch. A hollow, still present, still pulsing like a scar too deep to fully fade. Visa's Ma stood across from her. She had not cried, she had not fallen, but something inside her had broken. He had shaped her, not with kindness, not with cruelty, but with absence. He had been her master not because he taught her, but because he took from her everything. And now that he was gone, she did not feel free. She felt exposed, like standing under sunlight after years buried underground. Mitra moved first. She approached the shattered space where Nihilus had once stood. There was nothing there. No bones, no robes, only fragments of metal and dust. She reached down, not to touch, but to acknowledge, to say something. But what could be said? He had no name, no face, no grave. Even his voice had not been his own. Just hunger. Visas stepped beside her. She knelt not in reverence, but in memory, and whispered the words no one else would ever hear. "Thank you for showing me what not to become." The silence answered. Mitra did not look back. She turned slowly and began walking toward the exit. The Ravager groaned above her. Metal twisted, beams bent, as if the ship too wanted to fall apart now that its master was gone. But it would hold just long enough. Behind her, Visas rose and followed. Two survivors, both wounded by Malachor, both changed by the void. As they neared the hangar, the Force began to shift, softer, less burdened, but not healed. Because Nihilus had never been just one man. He had been a symptom of war, of grief, of forgetting what it meant to feel. And in that sense, he would return. Not as a ghost, not as a Sith, but as an emptiness inside all who refused to listen. The ship's doors opened. Cold light from the nearby star spilled across the hull. Mitra paused. One last glance. Not out of regret, not out of fear, but to make peace with what had happened. He had been a victim of Malachor, and then its reflection. A man so broken he forgot how to die, until someone stood before him, not with rage, but with understanding. And only then did he fall. As the Ebon Hawk pulled away from the Ravager, Visas sat in silence. She no longer felt his presence, no longer heard his voice in her mind, but something remained. The weight, the cost, the memory. She did not ask where they were going. She did not need to. Wherever the Jedi exile walked, she would follow. Not as a slave, not as a shadow, but as someone who had looked into the heart of nothing and chosen to live anyway. Behind them, the Ravager drifted. Quiet, forgotten by the galaxy, feared by those who knew the name Nihilus, but in truth, he was not a name. He was not even a man. He was what the Force became when we stopped listening. And now, at last, the galaxy could begin to listen again. He did not scream when he died, because there was nothing left of him to scream. No body, no blood, only a tremble in the Force and the slow collapse of a shape that should never have existed. On the broken bridge of the Ravager, surrounded by silence and shadow, the Lord of Hunger fell. But his fall was not an end. It was an echo. His mask, the last remnant of his humanity, drifted in the vacuum as the battle above Tellers burned behind it. There were no eyes behind it, no flesh. Only the memory of a man who had once been consumed by war and had then consumed everything in return. Somewhere deep in the black of space, the mask was pulled toward a wound in the Force, an old wound, a place already broken. Malachor V, the world that had given birth to his hunger, called him home. No one saw it land. No one marked the crater where it fell. No Sith dared go looking for it, and no Jedi believed he had truly existed. But beneath that scorched and cursed world, surrounded by a stillness colder than death, the mask waited. Not like an artifact, not like a symbol, but like a presence that refused to fade. For centuries, Malasan would remain untouched. The surface cracked, the tombs below sealed, the dark teachings of the Traus Academy left to rot. And yet something remained. Something that the Force itself tried to forget and could not, because Nihilus did not die. He had already abandoned life long ago. And death has no hold on that which has emptied itself of everything. Jedi masters who dared to meditate near the Outer Rim spoke of strange shadows, dreams that were not their own, hollow voices that said nothing but still screamed. One Miraluka outpost in the unknown regions went dark without explanation. Their foresight, once their gift, turned against them, not by violence, but by proximity. Ships that passed Malachor on old hyperspace routes felt their nav systems flicker. Veteran pilots reported nausea, and in rare cases, despair. They could not explain it, because there was nothing to explain. Nothing lived on Malachor, nothing grew, but something remained. The hunger did not die, it merely went quiet, and the mask, broken, cracked, and untouched, continued to sit beneath the dust of a world already buried in sin. It was not an object of power, not anymore. The dark rituals etched into its fibers had long since faded. The life once behind it was erased by his final attempt to devour the Jedi exile. But the wound it carried was deeper than the material. It was not alive, but it was not dead either. Some Force sensitives, long after the fall of the Jedi Order, would stumble upon whispers in places they should not be. Caves, ruins, abandoned Sith libraries, and they would see the same thing. A mask, black and white, empty-eyed. Some tried to draw on it, to bind it, to claim the legend for themselves, but they all failed. Because the hunger does not serve, it consumes. It took no apprentices, no heirs, no chosen bloodline. The legacy of Darth Nihilus was not passed down. It spread like a sickness in the Force, slow, unseen, irresistible. Those who came close to the mask, if they survived, forgot what they had seen. Not because of magic, not because of will, but because the mind cannot hold what the Force itself tries to erase. He had become less than a shadow, a scar, a faint tremor in the deepest places of the galaxy. And that is why he endures. Not as a Sith Lord, not even as a man, but as the warning left behind by the Force itself. This is what happens when pain is left unchecked, when silence is worshipped, when hunger is obeyed. He became what the Jedi feared most, not because he was strong, but because he had nothing left to lose. And now, centuries later, his mask still waits. buried in a place no one visits, silent beneath the stone, not for resurrection, not for vengeance, but simply because it cannot be destroyed, because it is not a thing. It is a memory, and memories in the Force do not fade. The Jedi believed the Force was balance, but balance does not scream. Balance does not beg. Balance does not leave a scar that even time refuses to close. There were places across the galaxy where Jedi could no longer meditate, where the flow of the Force trembled beneath their thoughts, not from chaos, not from darkness, but from absence, an emptiness that did not belong. One that did not whisper like the dark side, and did not soothe like the light. It simply existed, a blank space, a silence inside the stream. Some called it a wound, others called it a grave, but those who had studied history long enough knew the truth. They had felt this sensation before, at Malachor, at Telos, on the far edges of the galaxy where old Mandalorian warfronts had turned to ash. Wherever Nihilus had walked, the Force had recoiled, not in fear, but in mourning, because he had not simply taken lives, he had unmade them. Even the Force which binds all living things could not recognize what he left behind, and so it forgot. Jedi Masters in the centuries that followed felt this absence when they touched certain stars in their visions, felt it like a bruise in the cosmic stream, a gap that refused to heal. They would not speak his name, some because they feared it, others because they believed it no longer mattered. But names are only for the living, and Nihilus was something else, a fracture, one that no archive could explain, no prophecy could predict, no master could teach, because he was not an enemy. He was a reminder, a monument to what happens when grief is denied, when power is sought to escape pain, not to heal it. Many years after his defeat, the Jedi exile, Mitra Surik, would describe her final battle against Nihilus as something worse than confrontation. She did not face a Sith Lord. She faced nothing, an endless invisible draw, a black current beneath her thoughts, like the Force itself was being pulled away. And yet he had failed, not because she was stronger, but because she had chosen to feel what he could not. The Force does not bend to hunger. It may shudder, it may tremble, but it remembers what harmony feels like. Nihilus did not, and that is why his legacy was never full, never clear, never complete. He left behind no temples, no apprentices, no teachings, only silence. A silence that the Force itself could not fill. For some, that is comfort, proof that such darkness cannot survive. But for others, it is worse. Because silence does not end. It waits, and when the Force stirs, it returns. Across the outer rim, certain Force sensitives began to notice strange effects. Blindness during meditation, visions that did not belong to them, pain with no origin. One Miraluka child, years after the death of Visas Ma, spoke of a voice she could not hear, but could feel. It did not teach. It did not threaten. It only reached, not for her, but for the Force within her. She was moved, resettled, isolated, and the voice faded. But what if it was not gone? What if the echo of Nihilus had learned something in its defeat? Not how to return, but how to wait. He had no body, no temple, no empire, but that is what made him harder to stop. He had become a wound that did not bleed, a presence that did not grow, a hunger that had stopped needing flesh and had begun to devour only essence. The Jedi learned to avoid the voids in the Force, the ancient tombs, the ruins lost in hyperspace storms. They told their Padawans to meditate elsewhere, to focus on the living, to forget what could not be touched. But the Force never forgets. It carries every scream, every silence, every scar. And somewhere, in that stream, the memory of Nihilus drifts, not as a warning, but as a question. What happens when the Force itself is wounded? What rises to fill the space? And what if that shape never fades? He was not the first Sith to chase immortality. But he may have been the only one who achieved it by letting go of everything that made him real. No name, no voice, no face. Only the mask and the wound it left behind. There are regions of the galaxy where starlight barely reaches, where the navicomputers stutter, where hyperspace lanes turn cold, and where even the Force is hesitant. The Jedi never mapped these places. The Republic never claimed them. They were simply called the unknown. But not everything there is unknown. Some shadows have names, buried beneath centuries of fear. One name was never spoken again. Not because it was lost, but because it still listens. On the outer rim of the Stygian caldera, beyond the collapsed hyperlanes of old Sith space, there are derelict vessels that drift in silence. No beacon, no signal, no crew, just hollow metal and cold memory. One such vessel, found by a Mandalorian scavenger fleet, bore markings long erased by time. The hull was torn open, the bridge untouched. At its center sat a blackened throne, welded to the durasteel, empty. But some of the crew claimed otherwise. They said they heard breathing, not like a man, but like space itself was inhaling, pulling. One by one, the crew vanished, not killed, not taken, just gone. Only the captain returned, eyes white, mind broken. He said no words, only held out a cracked helmet and dropped it into the void. They called it a ghost ship, but it was more than that. It was an echo, a fragment of the Ravager, Nihilus's flagship, believed to have been destroyed over Telos. But the Force remembers what metal cannot, and pieces of the past drift back. Years later, a Sith cult known only as the Nihilus formed in the shadows of Ordre Dharma. They did not worship strength. They did not seek power. They meditated in silence, starved themselves, wore no names, and in the dark they chanted without sound. Some Jedi believed they were mad. Others believed they were listening for something that no longer walked but still moved. Some called them fools, until one of them died in the heart of a Jedi temple. Without weapon, without resistance, every Jedi in the meditation chamber collapsed. Not in pain, but in stillness. They had not been attacked, they had been touched. The corpse had no life, no organs, no blood, only skin, and a black veil where the eyes should have been. That was the last time the Council allowed open exploration into the unknown regions, because it was not the dark side they feared. It was the absence of any side at all. And in that absence, something watched. There are whispers among older Jedi archivists that during certain full eclipses, the Force trembles, not from prophecy, but from memory, as if something long buried is shifting. Not awakening, but repositioning, making room. Because even in death, hunger waits. In the Outer Rim, there are rumors of Force sensitives disappearing without a trace. No battles, no lightsabers, no signs of struggle. Their ships remain, their tools untouched, their logs filled with confusion. The last recordings all end the same way, with silence, followed by a low pulsing vibration. One Jedi Master recorded it in a data crystal before her death. It did not resemble any known Sith chant, but it mirrored the ancient frequency patterns of Malakor's surface. The wound was active, not growing, not healing, breathing. Not like life, but like gravity. like something waiting to be filled. And as more stars die and more force nexuses are left empty, the pulse becomes stronger, not physical, not even spiritual, existential, a feeling that meaning itself is thinning, that the force is watching itself bleed from an old scar, and still no one speaks his name. Because he is not a warning, he is a mirror of what the force becomes when nothing is left to hold it together. And in the shadow of that mirror, the outer rim has begun to fracture, not with war, but with silence. Jedi feel it in their dreams. Sith feel it in their doubts. And in the space between, there is only drift, the kind that cannot be mapped, only felt, and perhaps followed. Not because they seek him, but because he is still seeking them, not to speak, not to teach, only to take. Because in the end, hunger does not chase, it waits, and out here, in the dark corners of the galaxy, waiting is enough. Long after Nihilus was gone, people still heard him. Not his voice, not his breath, just the echo of something they could not name. He had no grave, no funeral, only a mask buried on Malachor. But even that was not safe. The Sith never touched it again. The Jedi never took it, because even in silence, it pulsed. Not with the dark side, not with memory, but with need. They say the mask whispers when the force is quiet, that it calls to those who have lost everything, not with promises, but with emptiness, as if the galaxy itself were asking to be devoured. There were those who tried to study it, archaeologists, Force adepts, even a few Sith Lords. None stayed long. Some claimed to see stars vanish behind their eyes. Others spoke languages that had no sound. One man, a Force scholar from Ossus, stared into the mask for 8 days. When they found him, he had removed his own face. He had not died. He had unraveled. The Order classified the relic, labeled it Echo Class Containment. No visitors, no records. Only a single phrase etched into the vault door. He was not a man, he was the hole men fall into. That was all. Over time, Nihilus became a myth, a fable used to frighten initiates. Eat your food, or Nihilus will eat you. But the Force never laughed, because it remembered. He was not a lesson. He was not a villain. He was a result. The consequence of letting wounds fester, of ignoring screams too long, of pretending silence means peace. And because of that, his legacy remained. Not in temples, not in holocrons, but in the fear of forgetting what pain can become. Centuries passed. The Sith rose again, fell again, changed names, changed faces, but never changed nature. And every time a war ended, every time a peace began, the mask on Malachor pulsed, not because it hoped, but because it knew. The galaxy always returns to hunger. Some Jedi Masters argued over his place in history. Was he a Force wound that became sentient? Was he a man who fell too far? Or was he the Force's own attempt to consume itself? None agreed, because they were asking the wrong question. Nihilus was not about answers. He was about what happens when the questions are left to rot. There are stories told in hidden Sith enclaves, whispers that his essence still moves through the cracks of the galaxy, that those who starve themselves in the Force may hear him. And once they do, they never eat again. Not because they are full, but because they are becoming him. Lisa's Ma once said something before she vanished. To be his voice is to forget your own. No one saw her again. Perhaps she was freed. Perhaps she was consumed. Or perhaps she became the silence he left behind. The Ravager was destroyed. His body collapsed. But no one ever found his essence. Because Nihilus was never whole enough to be destroyed. He was a whisper, a hunger, a choice. And in the hearts of those who carry loss like a second skin, that choice still lingers. Because every time the Force falters, every time a Jedi feels nothing in place of hope, he is there, waiting, listening. Not for weakness, but for silence. Because it is in silence that hunger begins. And it is in forgetting that he is remembered. He did not die. He did not live. He became, and what he became cannot be undone. Not by lightsabers, not by will, not even by time. Because hunger does not age. It only waits for something else to forget how to heal. And the Force, for all its power, still has scars it cannot close. One of them wears a mask, and somewhere in the dark, it is still listening.